Why did you look at Gary Barnett and why did you look at these two projects?
Well, Gary has always been one of the most fascinating people in the industry. He's been around for a long time, but in the last few years, he's become sort of synonymous with Billionaires Row. And everyone's been talking about Billionaires Row for a few years. It's become the symbol of the boom. And he was really the pioneer there who went in first and built, 6,000, 7,000 square foot apartments at a time when no one thought that anyone would buy those. So it's sort of a look at, 5, 7 years later, he's trying to do it again. He's trying to build another record-breaking tower on Billionaires Row, but it's a very different time in the market. It's at a time where that market has been proven. People have paid 7, 8, even 9,000 a square foot for apartments. But the market for those apartments is starting to wane. So it's, we're on the tail end of that cycle rather than the front end.
This is projected to cost north of $2 billion, right?
Yeah, so the total capitalization of the project is about $3 billion.
Okay. That compares, I guess, if you would compare that with an office tower. One World Trade was in that range, right? So we're basically comparing a condominium project to one of the largest office buildings in the country. So that is as ambitious as you can get, right?
It absolutely is. And he's building at a time when the money that he needs to finance that project is extremely hard to come by.
Why is that?
Well, I think in general, banks are overexposed to this type of product. All the developers kind of rushed into this market at the same time. They all followed each other in. Everyone thought they could get the same prices as the guy next door. And it kind of turned out that maybe there weren't as many buyers as they thought, and the market started to cool down.
But what is it about Gary Barnett and this particular initiative that makes it such an interesting story?
I think it's such an interesting story because it is so ambitious, and he is moving ahead with it at a time when other developers are really pulling back. And he's having to be very creative with the financing that he's coming up with. He's having to look to China. He's getting money from other developers. He's leveraging the EB-5 immigration program. He's really cobbling together these loans from lots of disparate places. And there's this huge question mark over whether the gaps that are remaining will be filled.
And when we say gaps, just for our listeners or our viewers, that's a $1 billion plus gap, correct? For both the projects?
Well, so the two projects that we looked at were Central Park Tower on 57th Street and 1 Manhattan Square on the Lower East Side. And for 1 Manhattan Square, it's a little bit further along and it's a little more proven in its concept. There's a $190 million gap, which is huge, but in Gary Barnett terms, maybe not that huge. Whereas with Central Park Tower, we're talking about somewhere in the range of 1.2 billion.
That includes a $900 million construction loan.
Yeah, that's
which would be the largest construction loan of this cycle.
Yes, I believe so. So $200 or $300 million he's expecting to come from the EB-5 program, or maybe some other, smaller bank loans. And then the $900 million construction loan is the biggest question mark.
So what has he done already at Central Park Tower?
So he bought the land with a loan from Blackstone, and then he put in a lot of equity himself. He was, very clever in signing a deal with Nordstrom to bring them in and do a department store on the lower floors of the building. So he actually sold that to them, which capitalized the project more. And then more recently, he made a deal with a huge Shanghai conglomerate called SMI, and they
developed the Shanghai Tower, correct?
Yeah, the tallest tower in Shanghai. And they contributed about $300 million in equity towards the project.
But it's not straight equity. There's serious strings attached.
Well, that's what's really interesting about the deal is that there is a whole series of strings attached. So he has to pay his Blackstone loan back by the end of the year. If he doesn't, his interest rate skyrockets from 8% to 14%, which is a big deal. And then with SMI, he has until next July to get his construction loan, and if he doesn't, they reserve the right to force him to sell the whole project.
How did you get all this information? Because this is, in New York, in real estate, I think transparency for reporters is great, but obfuscation is what developers want. They don't want this kind of stuff out there. So how were we able to achieve the level of detail that we had in the story?
I think the biggest tool that we were able to leverage for sure was the Israeli bond market. So a couple of years ago, Gary was trying to raise some money. He eventually sort of went public on the Israeli bond market, raised about $400 million.
Sort of SEC on steroids requirements, right?
Exactly. People say that it's even more stringent than in the US. So Extell has been historically a very opaque company to us, but the fact that they're now on the Israeli bond market and they're essentially public means that they have to disclose a lot more information to their investors than they might have otherwise. And that was a gold mine for us.
Yeah.
We wish every developer would go public.
Developers, if you're listening, please go raise money on the Israeli stock exchange. So you had all this information for the market, and then you went to Gary.
Yes, we went to Gary. He doesn't give many interviews, but he really likes the numbers, and he was very open to discuss on the market and the numbers and the logistics and all this.
Did he still have his flip phone, or has he upgraded since then?
He did not have it when I was in the office.